Well, good evening. Good evening. Thank you all so much for joining us for Book Talk Tuesday. We've had 3 so far. This is the 4th one, and I'm truly delighted to welcome you on this Tuesday evening. Do me a favor, as you're coming on, as you're logging on, go ahead, click share, invite someone else to this meaningful dialogue. I am truly looking forward to what's going to be shared on this evening. I'm excited because I've got my major mentor. I'll introduce him in just a moment, but so I'm looking forward to what we're going to share tonight. Is we're going to have a great conversation in regards to reconciliation and reparation. So again, please go ahead, click share, invite others to join this dialogue, posted in seminary groups, church groups. This is going to be one of those talks you're not going to want to miss. You're going to want to make sure others are a part of it as well. And during the conversation, you may have questions or certain things that you want to express as you hear the dialogue. So we invite you to definitely engage in the conversation in the chat, so we are able to actually put your comments up on the screen. I've been taught that that's kind of a preacher way of being jazz. And so we respond to the congregation. So we invite you to take part in that. Black congregational or call and response congregations. And so we can do that virtually as well. All right. So listen, I am delighted to welcome to our Book Talk Tuesday this evening, the final one, none other than the Reverend Dr. Joseph Norman Evans. Dr. Evans serves currently as the Dean of Morehouse School of Religion in Atlanta, doing a phenomenal job there. Dr. Evans, for me, is my mentor. I served on staff with him at Mount Carmel Baptist Church in Washington, D.C. for a decade, y'all. Like literally, he mentored me, molded me for 10 years. And so I know that I am the bookworm that I am today because of Dr. Evans, and my academic pursuits have been influenced by Dr. Evans. And so I'm tremendously delighted to welcome Dr. Evans. Dr. Evans, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Dr. Ball, thank you for the invitation. I have a couple of things just in the intro that I need to say. You've heard me say this privately, but I want to say it publicly to audiences. I cannot overly express my admiration for the ministry that you are leading. You turned out to be the person and preacher and pastor that I thought you would be. In spite of your 10 years of being around me, you turned out extremely well. And but I do have one thing I want to ask you. Why in the world did you have me come on here after W. Franklin Richardson? What was that something you did just to mess with me?
That is funny. So I met Dr. Richardson through Dr. Evans as well. He's, as you all got to hear last week, a major figure. We're even blessed tonight to have the president of Clinton College on with us as well, Dr. Lester McCoy. Good evening. Thank you for tuning in as well. So look, for those who are watching, Dr. Evans and I have done this kind of dialogue multiple times. I was on his staff. We used to set up the little camera. So I kind of got my start with this really with him, as he would write articles or begin to write chapters really of his first book, we would sit down and we would have dialogue about it. So this is definitely kind of that continuation, as we are now talking about one of his books called Reconciliation and Reparation, Preaching Economic Justice. So as we have this dialogue, for those who are members of Uplift Church, you may very well hear in this a lot of my theological influences, my cadence in preaching, as far as particularly the content of my preaching and my social justice work has really been informed by my apprenticeship, really, with Dr. Evans. So, Dr. Evans, why this book?
It's very interesting you asked that. I was working on a slide presentation for a presentation that's coming up in the next several days, and I came across something in the presentation, looking at Lydia in the book of Acts. And when you look at the 16th chapter of the book of Acts, you see the narrator, presumably Luke, and he talks about all the places that Apostle Paul was to go. He starts, in essence, saying that the Spirit prevented them from going east, and they turn west. They go to Mysia, Troas. And they go to Philippi and then to Macedonia. And when they get there to this Roman colony, right, Apostle Paul is there for a few days. And then on the Sabbath day, they go outside the gate and they go down to the river where Lydia was one of the worshipers. And she hears Apostle Paul preach and is converted, and also her household. And it came to me that a lot of a confluence of events had to take place prior to her being saved. And I think that's probably for all of us. There was a lot of confluence of events that happened prior to me being able to write the book that we're talking about tonight. And I think, Dr. Ball, some of the experiences during the pastorate at Mount Carmel, where, as you well know, we were facing the gentrified area. Once clearly African Americans lived there for years. And the city, economic development community turned toward that space. And we know, you and I and others from Uplift and whomever is listening across the country are clearly aware that gentrification is as much as colonization or recolonization. If you think we've ever been decolonized, we can talk about that if you want. But and I think that had an influence because I realized that the economic depravity that we as a people face was taking place in real time and space. And therefore, you and I and others like us were literally chroniclers of the current events going on. And I was in New Orleans, someplace you are very, very familiar with. And I had walked out of the Hilton, which I think is on Poydras. Don't get me wrong, I think it's on Poydras. But I walked down going to the riverside. As people, want to know, I used to wonder for years how at the bottom where the river is, that's actually the south, and the lakeside is north, but the West Bank is west, right? And perhaps for the 40th time, I've asked you this, but never on air. I want you to explain that to me again. But I was walking down, and I turned to go on Ponce Simon Bolivar to go across to what you and I would know to be Mid-City. And I walked down there and went by the bread. There's a bread factory on the corner there. And you can smell the bread, which is amazing. For those of you who don't realize, New Orleans is many, many things. But New Orleans also has probably some of the best bread in the world. And of course, the coffee is second to none. And oftentimes you smell that in the mornings. And so I was walking and I was just reminiscing, as you know, had a lot of time there. And I turned around, and this was just after, really, certainly maybe a decade after Katrina. But when I looked there, it looked to me similarly to it wasn't a lot of progress among those Black folks in those houses. And then I turned back and looked at the dome. And I said, look how close our people are living to absolute wealth. Mm-hmm. And the proximity of the wealth with this economic deprived, it hit me so hard. And that's when I realized that I needed to write the book. Mm-hmm. And once I get that original idea and can kind of through a confluence of events, it comes to me. And I just felt it was a need to write the book. So that's sort of how it came about.
Gotcha. Okay. That's helpful. And as you described that piece with the Superdome and the proximity of those who are impoverished, you even open up by kind of commenting that poverty is tolerated in proximity with increasing unrequited income and wealth inequalities. I mean, in New Orleans, we know it's a regular thing. You could be on one street in the absolute hood, on the same street, cross a block over, and you are in a wealthy area, same exact street. We see the same thing in Baltimore with their stadium there, and right on the outskirts of that stadium is abject poverty. Or in the nation's capital, we see the same exact thing right on the outskirts of the nation's capital. Prior to gentrification was abject poverty. So we do see that kind of tolerated proximity. And so you make an argument when it comes to preachers and our preaching, that in the 21st century, effective preaching is prophetic. I'll unpack that. I'll have you unpack that a little bit. Well, let me pause there, because when we think of prophetic preaching for Black folk, we generally think of speaking truth to power, and we can talk about certain political realities, things of that nature we readily accept. But you challenge even those who consider themselves to be prophetic in preaching by saying in the 21st century, prophetic preaching is prophetic preaching when it addresses closing the income wealth gap. So unpack that a little bit. Why is it that prophetic preaching now must make this a primary focus? And if I don't do that, am I still within the lane of prophetic preaching?
Well, so that's a very good question. No one has ever asked me that of all the times I did this, what we're doing now, did I recall. So maybe you are the answer to Charlie Rose after all on PBS, now that he's gone. So first of all, let me say this. I don't want to be draconian about what is prophetic in respect to the prophet that is, say, John the Baptist, who is standing out somewhere by the River Jordan and calling folks vipers, it broods of vipers. But on the other hand, we also know that your namesake for your next to baby son, Nathan, was a prophet who knew how to speak to kings in a way that he didn't get his head chopped off, right? You know, John the Baptist told the truth and lost his head. Nathan told the truth and lived to tell about it. Equally prophetic, I think. But to make a more cutting comment, a lot of what you and I hear that is characterized as prophetic preaching is priestly preaching. It's not prophetic because prophetic preaching, priestly preaching is more of a blues, comes from a blues place. It can tell us what is wrong, and we are able to cathartic. We're able to identify with those challenges. But priestly preaching doesn't tell us what we're going to do about it.
Mm-hmm.
Prophetic preaching says to the blues preacher, you right, but we're jazz musicians. What we going to do about it?
Mm-hmm.
And so they create improvisation looking for a new temporal unity, right? I would call that prophetic. And to add to that, I think the prophetic preacher has to be a part of a movement. So, for example, Dr. King was easily identifiable as a prophetic preacher because obviously he was leading the historic, perhaps the most historic, well, I don't think perhaps, I think the historic movement in American history. When Dr. King got up to preach, we knew what his ethos was and we knew what his pathos was. We knew what he was emotionally attached to. We knew his credibility. And so we listened with a different ear.
Mm-hmm.
To be prophetic, in my view, is to be called to a specific task at a specific time. Mm-hmm. And I posit that the number one issue of our time is the economic inequality gap, income and wealth gap. Just the other day, I came across a statistic. I'm not sure I was even aware of this. We always talk about the 1%ers controlling roughly 45% of all income and wealth, in the top 70% of all income and wealth. But what I was not aware of is that 1% controls 80% of all stocks. That's not a democracy.
Right.
It can't be.
Mm-hmm.
And so those types of issues, demanding reparations, I believe, is the justice motif of our times.
So with this, you say, for one, these conversations about this justice motif, this economic justice, these conversations have to emerge organically when these preachers are operating, and even beyond that, not just preachers, but those who are called by Jesus Christ, who understand the importance of it. So these conversations help some preacher who hears it and agrees with you, but is looking for something else to be that catalyst of where the conversation is coming from. You make an argument that it happens organically. It's not going to be from the top down.
I don't think it will be. I think it has to be a groundswell of a organized liberation march. I think that the so-called top-down are a part of the plutocratic oligarchy system, and power yields nothing. And if the 1%ers are invested, they're not going to tell us, yeah, you're right. And even if they know we're right, they're not going to do anything about it. So it has to happen in my view, from the bottom up. There are very different variations of strategic models that people can take hold of, but ultimately it has to be, when to borrow, Marxist terms, that I think, what is that in the 21st century? They're just terms, but the proletariat has to say enough is enough. I'll give you a prime example, and I'm sure you probably reached to this, and I don't want to get ahead of you, but the January 6th terrorist activities in Washington had a lot to do with the proletariat, misguided proletariat, not recognizing that the real culprit were two-headed monster, maybe a three-headed monster. But first, it was the exploitation of white underclasses. Mm-hmm. Whites have to recognize that Black folks have done nothing to them. So they should be really engaged in a class struggle. Wealthy whites, poor whites, not in a racist battle because we've done nothing to them. The problem is, through consciousness, they are attached to white skin privilege with the hope of hitting the jackpot. And of course, that is a clever manipulation that has worked among whites hyperbolically since the beginning of time. Of course, I don't really want to say that because they weren't there in the beginning of time.
Or at least the rebellion.
Yeah, right. So somehow the organization of resistance to empire does not begin with empire.
Mm-hmm.
Begins with those who resist.
Right. It has never begun with empire, right?
Never will.
Right.
Yeah.
Good. So again, it has to be that organic piece. And I can remember when I first started reading the book, I was gripped by something. I just want to make mention of this. And you said you heard this echoed by Dr. Kevin Cosby, president of Simmons College there in Kentucky. And Cosby cited nearly verbatim a story that appeared in The Nation magazine entitled "The Average Black Family Would Need 228 years to build the wealth of a white family today." Mm-hmm. When hearing that, and even it pushes further, the author argues if the current economic trends continue, the average Black household will need 228 years to accumulate as much wealth as their counterparts hold today. So 228 years from now, we're just still trying to catch up. They would almost have to stop. When people hear that, that's such a jarring number. And for the average white family, it's hard for them to see themselves having that kind of wealth. Because there will be those who will say, well, I don't have that. My Black neighbor has more than I do. Help somebody understand that kind of gap and what you mean when you reference the average white family.
Mm-hmm. So if we were to pull out some statistics, economic statistics, and let us say that Sally has earned her bachelor's degree from Clinton College. She has a bachelor's degree, and a white who may have finished high school has more access to capital and could statistically make nearly, if not more money than a graduate from a college. Right. So it starts institutionally. It's institutionally embedded into the system to prevent us access to capital. Right? That's one part of it. Another part of it, of course, is the institutions of the United States are designed from the inception of this country to exclude people of color. In fact, if you were to read historians, secular historians, they would tell you and me that without the Civil War, slavery could have conceivably continued well into the 1940s in the United States. Free labor, nobody's trying to get rid of free labor. And in addition to that, the Constitution of the United States was written with the notion that Black people would not survive, that genocide imposed upon Black people, and for that matter, even Native Americans, but particularly Black folks, that the chattel would die out. So the nation was always designed for white privilege, white patriarchal privilege to be exact. And so the system, whether it is philosophically, whether it's religiously, whether it is economically, whatever the institutional spheres are, they are designed to prevent a groundswell of minority economic security.
So for those who are watching, that's kind of the preface, just to whet your appetite to the book. There, Dr. Evans starts being just Dr. Evans. He begins to unpack and unlayer so many things in the book. He starts with this idea of a collective cultural biography. And in talking about this collective cultural biography, that there is this part of a narrative that seemingly impacts all of us. You talk about James Baldwin being also in a Du Boisian prophetic tradition, challenging Eurocentric truth claims. And this is what you state. The American Negro and people of African descent, wherever they may be located in the diaspora, has the great advantage of having never believed the collection of myths to which white Americans cling, that their ancestors were all freedom-loving heroes, that they were born in the greatest country in the world has ever seen, or that Americans are invincible in battle and wise in peace, that Americans have always dealt honorably with Mexicans and Indians, and all other neighbors are inferiors, that American men are the world's most direct and viral, that American women are pure. You talk about this collective kind of idea that really, that's almost that Du Boisian double consciousness, in that Baldwin is arguing Black folk have never bought into. We've always seen a different side, which is why it is that on January 6th, many Black folk were not as shocked, or even with the previous election and the outcome of that election. A lot of the white world was shook up. But Black folk were like, well, we kind of knew that the Charlottesville piece. Black folk are not shocked because so talk about this collective biography here.
Well, so let us start with the dominating culture's collective biography. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, all of us have been exposed to it and know it. Black, white, and otherwise, the national narrative and biography is the white biography. Mm-hmm. And so we're all exposed to it immediately. So the psychology of white America is they believe their mythologies. They've long since forgotten that it's mythology. They carry that over from Greek mythology and Roman mythology, right? So they mythologize this country. Now, that is difficult in itself, but they've also done it in their theology and theological practice, right? Their God is made in their image and likeness, right? So to be white is to be nearly God. That's on the one hand. But Black folks have always known it wasn't true for the most part, because we had a strong indication of looking at them and their flaws. I think, in hindsight, I think that's what the movie The Butler was about. And I think that was what The Help was about, was that we as Black people knew that white people were human like other people. They had so many bones, a left ventricle, right atrium, left atrium. And so their anatomy and physiology is, skeletal systems like everyone else's. But psychology is so powerful that the white mythology currently has come to a place where if we were to place the white mythology into a teeming teapot, it has come to a boil and a steam. And white America is in a place where they don't know what to do. But it has had tremendously detrimental effects on us as a people as well, because we can't seem to get whites to admit, first of all, that we are human. Mm. I mean, the real argument right now is if we pull all the layers off, there's still a notion that we are not human, right? We're not equal to you because we're not human, right? And so we have these clashing psychologies where we are seeing flaw lines and fault lines to where currently in our society. Now, if we put on top of that, which I think is the major topic of tonight, the economic justice piece, that further complicates. And instead of saying, you know what, we repent, no, they double down. Mm-hmm. The current state of the nation where the former Dolce, former president of the United States, Mr. Dolce, he's Mr. Mussolini gone. His acquittal was to double down on white male supremacy. That's the metaphor, right? We are still in charge. And it's destroying the very fabric of the possibilities of the nation. And so that collective biography, which was written on white mythology, is just that, it's mythology. And it's lasted for a considerable long periods of time, but we see cracks in the armor now, don't we? Mm-hmm. And we believe that if we double down, if you will, on preaching economic justice as a justice motif, then let's see what God is going to do.
So the reason I had to address that piece is because from there, again, that's more of that foundational piece. You talk about this collective biography that people have really bought into, to suggest that in order for us to be really effective in this conversation about reconciliation and reparation, that we got to have a different way of speaking. We got to have our own kind of narrative. And so to kind of unpack that need, you first began to talk about the Poor People's Campaign. I can remember, I'll get to this in just a second. I had a conversation with you when you were finishing this chapter, actually. We happened to have a conversation. You had one talk with Dr. Walker. So we'll get to that in just a second. But in that, you began to look at E. Franklin Frazier's perspective of the church. I want to kind of unpack this because there you make some cutting statements that others may not understand. So I want you to address it. So you say, first of all, if terrorism is successful, its goal is to annihilate people's cultural roots and eventually to destroy the presence of an entire racial construct. Then you say, we are people who have been and continue to be manipulated psychologically. We are people who have been and continue to be among the first of many people denied our human rights to self-identities on American soil. So you began to make this argument about American empire. And until now, we have not made any clear distinction between Frazier's characterization of the Negro and his Negro church. Is there a difference, Dr. Evans, between Negro and Black, between Negro church and Black church, or even Pan-African, which you kind of get to a little later on. You outline that. You say this here: the Negro is a compliant person who has perfected emulation, if not adoring belief in the superiority of the Eurocentric church, its culture, and its dominating narrative. Unpack that. This Negro church, and being compliant and adoring this Eurocentric perspective.
Yeah. So since writing that book, that has been spoken. People have asked me about that, both Black folk and white folk. And the Negro church, and let me digress and say, we're talking about pathology here. Pathology has a lot to do, again, with the psychological self and hermeneutic. One of the things I've learned over the years is that hermeneutics is as much psychological as it is exegeting and trying to interpret the context of a text. So without becoming a psychologist, we have to be aware that hermeneutics is a philosophical position as well as a psychological condition. Hermeneutically, then, the Negro, whether churched or unchurched, has been conditioned to believe that if she or he can perfect assimilation or accommodation of Eurocentric values, then white folks will be accepting and then stop putting a boot on our neck. You see how that has worked out, right? Mm. So we know that's not true. But still, the Negro is not aware of her or his double consciousness. Mm-hmm. Double consciousness is to look to see what the oppressor needs before she or he will look to see what the oppressed need.
Jesus.
That's how the Negro is programmed to think. On the other hand, the emergent Black person, by the way, when I say emergent, I'm talking about recent times. We can look back in history. We can go all the way back to Phyllis Wheatley and see that she, had what you and I would characterize as a Black mind. Mm-hmm. Nat Turner, Gabriel Presser, Harriet Tubman, and on, right? And of course, Denmark Vesey. Mm-hmm. Are the most laudable ones. Henry Highland Garnet, Frederick Douglass, and on and on.
Before you get to the more contemporary, I know you're probably going to go toward the Black Power move. You make a statement here with regard to this Negro pathology and how it shows up in film. And you allude to shows like Scandal and Empire and Blackish being simply a redo of the Jeffersons and the Cosby shows from the 1970s. You suggest that these sitcoms are offensive to radicalized people of African descent because they reinforce stereotypical characterizations. And that's when you kind of make that push, saying by contrast in the 1960s, you saw this intellectual class who emerged with this more Black thought and given rise to Stokely Carmichael's Black Power. So kind of unpack that emerging kind of thought of this different consciousness of Black Power here.
Okay, so again, think about, just to finish the thought, they're intersecting people. So what I'm talking about here is what I would consider the norm. Mm-hmm. There were outliers throughout. So there were people trying to break through, or the Harlem Renaissance writers to some degree, right? But what I'm getting at is, as a normalized psychological condition is the Negro. Mm-hmm. And so as E. Franklin Frazier I think, rightly and articulated, was our institutions, such as the church, took on the Negro value system, which was to emulate European values. Well, that's a double consciousness show all day, isn't it? I mean, you go to church and you got your double consciousness going, whether we're aware of it or not. And I was saying in the book, as I recall, that the Negro is not aware she or he has double consciousness. It's just a way of life. Whereas the Black person, she or he knows they have double consciousness, and therefore they are resisting it. We still have it, but at least we know it. Mm-hmm. And therefore we make correctives so that that is not what controls our lives. So when you get to, and by the way, there's some arguments to be made that, Du Bois was probably, I argue in another place that Du Bois was the father of Black theology. I think that Howard Thurman made his work acceptable to the church with the bifocal lens that you read about in Jesus and the Disinherited, and Evan Crawford picks that up in The Hum. But I think Martin King had a lot to do with it. And I'll tell you what, I hope I'm not getting too choppy for folks, but one of the things that helped was when Dr. King came, we had moved into a post-structural era. Mm-hmm. New archetypes, new narratives, new ways of looking at things. And so Dr. King's alternative narratives could very well be a part of that liberation motif that we're really getting at, that is necessary for us to stop being Negroes. We've got to push toward liberation. Mm-hmm. But of course, the one that everybody thinks about is Dr. Cone. Dr. Cone starts writing, telling everybody that Jesus is Black, God is Black. Mm-hmm. I think 21st century, that sounds about right. Sounds about right. Mm-hmm. And so we move forward in that context. But also, Dr. Cone admits that he was influenced by the Black power motifs that were brewed, which were liberation motifs, right? So we are at a place now that if our preachers disavow Eurocentric hermeneutics, disavow or deconstruct, to borrow a term, the European narrative, deconstruct the European rhetoric. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a whole corpus of African rhetoric that we don't even talk about. Mm-hmm. And of course, those persuade us and have an intersection with Black theology. Black theology accepted by Black churches, we have Black praxis. And then we start thinking about what our people need, and we're not looking for permission from the white gaze on whether we should do it or not. Mm. If it is from God, revealed to his church, then we should be doing it.
Wow, powerful. That is powerful. So you introduce this idea of we have to have a new paradigm. You got to have a new way of thinking. Then you pick it up later on when you talk about Alan Bostic. But before that, I don't want to miss this piece. This is, I remember riding in the car and you were so excited about this thing that you kind of came across, and that is with Dr. King and this this idea about what you heard from, or what you gleaned from Dr. Wyatt T. Walker's account of Dr. King, particularly sitting at a restaurant. Because most people remember the I Have a Dream Dr. King, and that's really all. And I can remember that same day, I myself and my friend, I think it was Dr. Baxter at the time, we were having coffee. You just so happened to come by, yeah, and you sat down with us, and you were just elated. These marches wasn't about singing Kumbaya with white folk. It was about economics. And what made you say that was basically your access to Dr. Wyatt T. Walker and his unpublished writings about Dr. King. And this is what you kind of pull out from Dr. Walker's statement. They were elated after having some levels of success. They were at Beeman's restaurant on Auburn Avenue. And while they were all beaming with success, Dr. King opined that he was not nearly as sanguine on our optimism, because they were like, well, if we did it in the South, we can do it everywhere. Dr. King was not as optimistic. There was no smile on his face as he soberly announced, until there is a fairer distribution of wealth in America, we are not going to make any major breakthroughs against racism. You argue here, and even suggested Dr. Walker was saying, that the Poor People's Campaign was really about Dr. King's driving motif. His prophetic urge was really about economic justice, not some, well, can we just eat at the restaurants with you?
Yeah. So let me start with the elation part. You know very well, viewing audience, Dr. Ball knows too much about me, but and that is not a joke. You know very well I can sit in a room for 4 hours just trying to get one thesis sentence before I move on, because I have to get it clear here before I can fully understand it. And you caught me on one of those days where I finally yeah, I got this thing. So let's think about this. Remember, this was in 1963. Martin King spent time in Birmingham jail. There was a bombing in 1963 in Birmingham in response. And then, of course, the March on Washington. Now, I have written in other places that the I Have a Dream civic sermon was a reparation sermon. We have come here to cash a check that you, America, says has insufficient funds. We refuse to believe that the vaults in America, right, is without these funds, right? Now, remember that Kennedys and Hoover and everybody got binoculars. They're waiting to see what this man is going to say. They got it. They knew what he was talking about. Now, let's also remember that Dr. King was a Southerner. He knew how to work among the oppressor. And so Dr. King was working way out in front of the people around him. He knew the end game, but he had to use the particular objectives, goals to reach before he got to his final objective. Now, so he comes back from Washington, and they go back to the SCLC office there on Auburn Avenue, and they're celebrating this amazing year, right? And Dr. Walker speaks as though it was some Shakespearean play. He says that Dr. King withdraws from the festivities and moves as a Shakespearean to a side, and the camera, the lights follow him like they're on the stage. So but the other brothers and sisters did not necessarily recognize Dr. King's mood change, and Dr. Walker said he walked over to him, and when it was like that, he didn't call him Dr. King. He said Martin. He may have said Mike. I don't recall now. And he asked him what the problem was, and Martin, without really looking at Dr. Walker, said, essence, unless we get economic reparations, this is not going to end. And so all of the people who were working with Dr. King knew as early as 1963 that they were going toward the Poor People's Campaign. So in 1964, they get the civil rights legislation signed, right? And that was because of the Atlanta marches. Marches still going on, of course, in North Carolina. in Greensboro. And so there are these protest marches, very effective targeted marches. 1965, Edmund Pettus Bridge forces the Voter Rights Act. So once King got Civil Rights and Voter Rights Act, from that point on, you notice that King is no longer what PBS has told us, the sanitized king.
Mm-hmm.
This king now is focused solely on access to capital.
Mm-hmm.
And the Poor People's Campaign was to bring in white poor and build a coalition to deconstruct within the white folks race, if you will, or white race, class struggle,
mm-hmm.
and do everything he could to persuade poor whites that you are in the same boat as black folks. He goes to Memphis, which I marvel at Dr. King. Dr. King was a moral man. And when I use the word moral, I think to be moral is to demonstrate we have the capacity to be empathetic toward fellow human beings, even when it costs us something. So King goes there to demonstrate solidarity with sanitation workers. And why wouldn't he? They're human. They are our sons, our daughters, our uncles. And Dr. King goes, and unfortunately, he doesn't make it out of Memphis. Dr. Walker believed, I've heard Andrew Young say it as well, that none of them thought that Dr. King was ever going to make it to Washington for the 1968 Poor People's Campaign, because he was carefully connecting the dots. He was creating a liberation narrative. He was composing his narrative with the support of a rhetoric, because you know that if you're going to use rhetoric, it helps you organize and arrange what you want to say. Well, he's arranging and organizing what he wants to say. 63, I have a dream. 64, Voter Rights Act. 64, Civil Rights Bill. 65, Voter Rights Act. 1968, he's building up to that. And you know that he was going to introduce the Poor People's Campaign because he wrote, "Where do we go from here? Chaos or community?" And perhaps the most provocative prophetic lines in that book, that is chaos or community, or where do we go from here? King says that the United States has to guarantee income or guarantee employment. And the institutional spheres, the vanguards, stakeholders of institutional spheres heard him say redistribution of wealth. I believe as soon as that book was finished, that Dr. King's days were numbered. As a matter of fact, if you go back and look at the copyrights of Where Do We Go From Here, Harper won, I believe, or it may have been Seabrook, Seabrooks. It may have been Seabrook, but whomever it was, there were limited copies to be published before Dr. King was assassinated, early in 1967, right? But in reality, the book in broad or wide publication, distribution did not come out until after he was dead. So Dr. Walker believes, and others, that Dr. King's prophetic courage to tell the nation the truth, that if you don't solve the economic issues of this country, that eventually it will come apart at its seams. You can't have folk walking around in proximity to wealth, and they are working and doing everything they possibly can to take care of their families, and they are living in poverty. Now, just a sidebar, this nation has still not gotten its message. Here we are, 500,000 people sleep among the angels because the country elected a president that reflected their own dysfunctionalities and their own mythologies about oneself. So we can now say that because, as Carol Anderson said in her book, what bothers whites today is not just because we're Black. What bothers them today is Black advancement.
Mm.
And Black advancement means that there are less opportunities for whites at the bottom rims, right? So all of this is teeming in the pot. And so they get the Dolce, Mussolini, Al Hitler. He says the things they want to hear and they elect him because he reflects their psychological dysfunction, right? So there's 500,000 people dead. And 71 million folks voted for El Duce, right? So that alone, and of course, to put it out there where everybody can see it, January 6th happened. So we are clearly aware that America is legion, has many demons that we cannot unattach from us as folks, as a nation. And Martin King saw this coming, right?
Yes, sir.
So you can see that I'm influenced by a long time of studying and understanding the narrative that has produced this moment where we should be focused on preaching the justice motif.
So let me take that, and I want to push it and have you unpack this piece about reparation and the term reconciliation. But in order to have people grasp it, I want to expose a little bit of your reference to Alan Bozak, and then we'll push to your unpacking this word reconciliation, because you make mention of Bozak, South African major liberation theologian, about this idea of the need for us to have a new consciousness, a new way of thinking. And for those who are watching this, this is really what kind of that Black power is, coming to realize one's own self and social location. So here you say, referencing Bozak, we cannot understand liberation theology, whether in South Africa, in Latin America, or other parts of the third world, unless we understand that it is developed within a framework of a new political consciousness. People become aware, first of all, of their own situation. There was a new consciousness of themselves, of where they were, of the political, social, and economic dynamics in their situation. When people began to understand their situations, they start asking questions they have never asked before. They first ask the question, when we get this new consciousness, why? And asking why, we began to discover that we have lived through a theological tradition informed through Eurocentrism at its lens, that although it was its own, was really never our own. We began to use it, but it's never our own. It has always been controlled by people who also control the political parties, the economic, and the social situation, our very lives. So you argue that what's important is this emphasis on this new consciousness, this new narrative. A new consciousness makes people aware of their own agency to cause change. So with this consciousness, you demonstrate this when you begin biblically and hermeneutically to unpack this term reconciliation, because a whole bunch of evangelicals will want to talk about this term of reconciliation, but from a Eurocentric perspective. So help us to understand how we can have a new perspective of this word reconciliation.
Okay. So think first of all, the new consciousness piece. Now that goes back to the pulpit.
Mhm.
If people are doing the work and they start from a position that both the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible, or the Old and New Testaments, are both liberation manifestos.
Mhm.
Yahweh is the hero, but Yahweh is consistently liberating his people from institutional or imperial power.
Mhm.
So you have to first start philosophically from the right place. And how do you do that? All you got to do is look around, if nothing else. But so psychologically, we come to terms that we have to decolonize the Bible. The Bible is not written for the rich and wealthy and the hegemonic. It is written from the worldview of the oppressed. That's number one. So that's the start of the new consciousness. But if one wants to think in terms of what a new consciousness looks like, one can only have to go to Mark 1 in verse, 14. Now John was arrested, and Jesus came into Galilee proclaiming the gospel of God and saying, the time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe the gospel. So Jesus says the gospel, the eulogon, the gospel of the ek besalon, the kingdom, is as near as your hand.
Mhm.
It's here, but you can't see it because you're colonized. You need to have the Holy Spirit deconstruct and perform spiritual surgery to remove your double consciousness that leans toward the oppressor. So number one, the new consciousness. And the more we preach from this position, the more people start asking questions. That's what that means there. Now, this reconciliation piece for people who did not believe, I use Luke's gospel with the Zacchaeus episode, the rich young ruler. Both of those are reparations piece. The reason the rich young ruler would not follow Jesus was because when Jesus told him to sell all that he had, the text says he went away sad, if you will, because he had many possessions. Well, that's some of it. But if you read it from a liberation piece, he didn't follow Jesus because he was aware that Jesus fully knew him.
Mm.
I mean, to follow Jesus is to accept that he fully knows us. Therefore, Jesus said to him, you've got to sell all, you have to give all that you have, to sell all you have and give it to the poor, because you got it from the poor.
Mhm.
You exploited the poor. You made your money off the backs of the poor. Jesus was telling me, I know how you got your money. Give it back. And because he no longer had a mythology about himself,
Mhm.
as though Jesus needed him, he found out not only does Jesus not need him, but rather for him to follow Jesus, he had to be as Zacchaeus. If I've wronged any man, I will exact him 4 times.
Mhm.
So when you compare the young ruler with Zacchaeus, we see that Zacchaeus was prepared to pay reparations. We see that the young ruler was not.
Mhm.
But for those who don't want to deal with that, I put out the New Testament and went to Pauline theology.
Mhm. Even before that, you unpacked the Old Testament version of it. And
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true. So I try to go to all of these places, but I paid a lot of attention to Pauline theology because I know that a lot of our Eurocentric brothers and sisters believe that Paul is the patron saint of the Bible and there's no one else. And so I thought, well, since you believe that, then let's go and work with Apostle Paul from the 5th chapter of Paul's second epistle to the church of Corinth. And isn't it interesting that the church of Corinth, with all of its spiritual gifts, the First AME Church or the First Baptist Church of Corinth, the First AME Zion Church of Corinth, they were the persnickety Corinthians because they had all of those gifts.
Mhm.
But they were the most dysfunctional folk could be on earth. And they could not understand because they couldn't get their flesh out of the way long enough to understand. So Apostle Paul uses a legal system to help them understand. And in essence, he uses the word reconciliation in all of its various tenses. Then the root word is where you and I would get the word elasio. It means to loose or to reconcile, right? And so Apostle Paul is saying until the two sides come together and agree on the terms, then there's no reconciliation that's taken place. There has to be change or exchange for the wrongs done. So if you and I were going to law school, one of the first things we would go to is a torts class. And we would learn these things in torts. Most people don't make it through torts. That's the first thing. If you can't get through torts, you ain't gonna be no attorney, right?
Right.
And so they learn this notion of what it means to sue folk or be sued in a civil case. And so in that respect, the term change or exchange is used. And, you know, I pulled this out. I'm not going to try to. So if you say all of this is from God, who through Christ reconciled us into himself. So he changed us to himself and gave us the ministry of changing. That is, Christ God was changing the world to himself, not counting the trespasses and trusting, Therefore, he says, and whenever he comes to that, therefore, he's now going to give a rhetorical proof in rhetoric, but it's an apostolic proof. Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ. God making his appeal through us. We implore you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled, be change agents, be change agents. Be change agents to God. For your sake, he made him also who knew no sin, that in him we might become righteous of God. So this last be reconciled is the final form. Paul is saying you got to go through these steps. When you get to this, be reconciled, he's saying this is the final form. This means something into the future. You are now ambassadors, but you must prove you're ambassadors by making sure that justice is served. I find that to be profound. And one other thing I'll say, and I don't want to say this in a way that is discounts what any of us do, because I was talking to someone today and they were asking me, you know, questions. And I said, no, you got that, you know, no. Now, let me help you. I came to Christ under a school teacher named Miss Willie Chambers, who could barely read better than the boys. She knew neither Hebrew nor Greek, but she loved our Lord, and it was obvious. And because of her sowing into my life, right, I've never been under any illusion that you have to be educated into some system to know Jesus. That's a lie. Jesus comes because Jesus loves us. And if we love him, he'll give you wisdom you cannot get from your institution. I know I can get a witness from somebody. But one of the things that helped me in my decolonization process, other than growing up around sisters with afros and dashikis, was being exposed to the original languages. One of the things I learned from the original languages was if I could read it for myself, I can understand it for myself. And therefore, I don't have to rely upon what other folks say from a European, tyrannical, hegemonic space. And so I urge anyone who could possibly get somewhere where you can be exposed to those languages. You may not remember them after you get out of school, whatever, but you at least know how to think independently of what you're reading. You don't have to rely on what other people tell you. You can come to it on your own. That's just something to say here. But the reconciliation piece is a justice motif. And Apostle Paul was aware of that the church at Corinth had, and you know that, they were messing with each other. We know that Paul says this because in 1 Corinthians, you know, and frankly, throughout, they were suing each other. They were doing stuff they shouldn't be doing, and they was doing stuff with somebody else's somebody you know you ain't supposed to be doing. They were doing all kind of crazy stuff. Right. And so he gave them a way to be reconciled, that reconciliation is a change or exchange. He put it down in legal terms because he knew they could understand that.
So you this change exchange piece, you're dealing with it helps expose something. It even helps me understand James Cone's preface to his Black Liberation and Black Theology book, where he starts in the 1970 preface by saying, there will be no peace in America until white people begin to hate their whiteness and beg, in essence, to be Black. And that's kind of a reconciliation piece, not saying necessarily that their skin color is going to change, but rather their social location is able to exchange and identify with. Jesus, in essence, did that. It's kind of what you were arguing for us. Reconciliation is that wealth, proximity to poverty, exchanging. I'm willing to come into some sort of relationship with you. So you suggest that kind of piece, particularly when it comes to races in America, but not just that. That's not all, because there is this restitution piece of it. Kind of outline with regard to the Exodus and with regards to the Zacchaeus kind of narrative. So to kind of summarize this for us, for one, we need to have a new kind of thinking. We cannot be bound by Eurocentric thinking, expecting that to be our saving grace. We cannot have this, I'm going to simply assimilate to their cultural norms. We got to have our own and own our own narrative. How do we push forward? You kind of outline a little bit about how do we take this narrative forward? We know now there's HR 40, which has continually come up with regard to reparations. How do we go forward with it?
Well, once again, let's think about why narrative is so important. Narrative, a good narrative has a lot of parts, but underneath it is pathology. It gets to the psychological self. And my view is critical memory is important, but we need not romanticize the good old days because they weren't so good in respect to how our people have been treated. Now, we don't run from that narrative. That's our story. But we got to cross. We've got to cross the Jordan. Put some stones up in the middle of the river. Do the Sankofa thing, and keep moving. That's number one. But that's not going to happen without informed thought leaders in the Black community, in my view. That starts with university presidents, college presidents, and pastors of churches. There are others, right? But those are the most identifiable because they're going to have the most intersections and bridges to our people, right? So we need people who are saying, this is our history. Now, this is the justice motif to bring our people toward a more whole space. By the way, the money we need, now I'm not looking for someone to give me a check. I wouldn't, but I would like to see diabetes studies. I would like to see things in institutions that are geared toward our people. I would like to see more medical schools attached to our colleges and universities. I would like to see chairs and all that kind of thing. You can go on and on about what we need. Everybody knows if they sat down and made a list of things we could do with $1 trillion, right? And some estimates is $17 trillion, by the way. And but it's really a psychological piece. The psychological part is, this is how you measure your worth and your wholeness. We know that because the other folks have hoarded the money. They've set up a system so the rest of us can't get it. So we know that's what you value. So for you to say you're sorry, you got to give up what you value. You have to change or exchange to have a restorative justice. And there may even need to be a retributional justice as well. Now, there are people who agree and disagree on what types of reconciliation. I think some I don't want to call names, but I think Desmond Tutu was more on the restorative justice, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where at one time I didn't think much of that, but now I think more of it than I used to. But I don't think the way forward for us is Black folks in America alone. And there are plenty of people, man, I've been on these calls like this right here, and I've been with people who have flat told me I was ignorant and that it was something that had to happen in the United States. There's a group of people who thinks that the reparations is for the descendants of slaves. And I never told them they're wrong. I've never told them they're wrong. I'm simply saying that if you're successful, praise Jesus. But my view is it's going to take a global effort because Black folks, wherever we're Black folks, we catching it. Yes, I'll give you a quick example, and people out there can Google it, I'm sure, and probably know it before I finish my sentences today. If we were to look at the prison rate, incarceration rate, England, Germany, France, wherever, I guarantee you there are more people of African descent in jail disproportionately to the population than anywhere else. One reason is because if you're economically deprived or socially deprived, that means you don't have health care. That means you're in a food desert. That means you don't have access to education, which eventually means you're not going to have access to education. And so it's a spiraling staircase in a descending fashion. But the second reason is, as James Baldwin discovered even in his exile in France, that shortly after World War II, when France was laissez-faire, as you would know from New Orleans and that type of language, and that France was moving into post-structuralism and was less race conscious at that time. But he noticed shortly as the Algerians started coming into France, the French remembered how to be racist. So we're nowhere in the world where Black people are not the trope, the living metaphor that is representation for racism and hatred, right? Mm-hmm. So in my view, there has to be some kind of coalitions similar to what Du Bois in the Pan-African conferences they had as early as, I guess, 1900 was the first one. Coming out of the Alexander Crummell years in 1897 and so forth. So think about post-colonialism, where Europeans went in and divided up Africa. Mm-hmm. And by the way, the most contested place on earth is the Congo with all of the resources there, right? So as a response, Dr. Du Bois and his cohorts said, we're not going to make it. If they colonize economically in Africa, mm-hmm. we're done. Yep. So we had to have a movement to where we try to get everybody together. I still think that's the correct way forward. It may not be the only way forward, but there has to be an international approach to the problems that we face as a people. And that means that we who are Africans in America cannot be arrogant like white folks in America and believe that people from other places cannot teach us something.
How?
We need to hear, pardon?
Like your reference to Bozak. And you learn a great deal from him about this consciousness piece.
So I think, for example, in our seminaries, whether it is Morehouse and the ITC, Howard, Hood, Shaw, Virginia Union, and elsewhere, we need to be studying African theology and African theologians. And to be honest with you, an emphasis on African womanist theologians, right? We need to read against our hearing, and learn to understand that in order for us to prove that we are Black and not living in our double consciousness unawares, we have to be open to critiques of other people. On the other hand, we can lend to them our American social location and advocate on behalf of others, because we have obviously proximity to some of these institutions that are destroying the lives of other people. But it does not mean that we know the way forward. Just before we started, Dr. Ball, and I'll yield to you, I was talking with Dr. McCorn about a thing, and we were thinking about when King came to iconic status, and it was his question. Incidentally, those of you who be careful, McCorn is somewhat like me. McCorn will ask you a question that he probably already knows the answer to, but I played along. I posit that Martin King became popular in 1963, but I believe he became iconic when he stood against the Vietnam War, when he preached at Riverside Church, because now he was prophetic. Yeah. The point is that once he came out against the Vietnam War, people from other spaces in the globe said, my God, finally, somebody in the United States actually knows that the war in Vietnam is wrong. Think about that for a moment, by the way. We have the so-called Mexican-American War, 1840 something, against people of color. We stopped for a little while and fight each other. Well, they fought each other. We joined forces when necessary. When they thought the Union was going to lose, they decided to enlist. And the movie is the 54th and everything. Glory is really underscoring that political necessity. But after that war, we go back to our colonialism, and then we have the Spanish-American War, and we go down and we take over and colonize once again the Caribbean, including Cuba. The San Juan Hill thing for Theodore Roosevelt. Thank God we took baseball to them, and they were exposed to baseball. But they fought against people of color. Mm-hmm. World War I and II. The Japanese ended up on the short end of the stick in both of those wars. People of color. Mm-hmm. The Korean War, or conflict as our country calls it, people of color. Mm-hmm. Vietnam War, we fought against people of color, and the Cambodians and the people of Laos were decimated because of our bloodthirstiness against people of color. And we weren't through. We had Desert Storm, right? And what was that? People of color. Iraqi freedom, people of color, right? The Afghani war, what? People of color. Our bombing of Iran and Syria about people of color. The United States has focused on people of color through militarism, as King had said, economic, what do you call it? He said militarism, racism, and I think the other one was economicism or something. I don't know, but it was three things that he called a three-headed.
Militarism, racism. I'm not sure if it was imperialism. I can't remember.
Probably capitalism.
Capitalism.
Whatever. Money.
Yeah.
And Dr. King understood that when we went to Vietnam, we were making our move. And by the way, we were going to 1 out of 4 infantry soldiers. Well, let's say it this way. 1 out of 4 combat arms troops were people of color. 25% of the folks that were going to die in Vietnam were going to be black males, right? Militarism, materialism. Thank you. That's the King expert. I'm just an interloper. And so these wars turned toward people of color. And Dr. King saw it. And he understood that this was not about religion. This was not about Buddhism being wrong or right. First of all, you don't have a right to kill Buddhists because they're Buddhists, and you don't have a right to go in and blow up their churches. Oh, but that's right. What the heck? You blew up our churches right here in this country. Why wouldn't you blow up those churches in that country? Or, you know, but the underlying point is King saw the shift as Du Bois saw, right? Du Bois saw the shift earlier, that 2/3 of the world are people of color. And eventually, if capitalism is going to survive, you're going to eventually have to deal with people of color if you're going to have new markets, right? Well, they don't mind having the markets if they can have a military zone and control militarily, as well as keep them impoverished, right? So all of those things have come to pass. That's in large part why we as people of African descent cannot be divorced from the fact that we are people of African descent. And we need to get with folks who are of the same boot on the neck in other spaces and have the dialogue about what are we going to do about this thing.
Amazing. Dr. Evans, you are just phenomenal in that you challenge. Even in this book, you talk about how we have to have a global perspective. But before we go, you're always working on something. So you want to give the people a glimpse of what's next for Dr. Evans? What's next on the press for you?
Well, I will do that. Thank you for asking, and thank you for this time. I don't know if did people ask questions or something that you need to answer?
We had one by Kevin Slayton. Kevin Slayton, former Howard student of yours. He and I took Dr. Evans for preaching, and you were his doctoral reviewer. He asked, what if any impact is Reverend Barber and the movement, Reverend Barber's Poor People piece, the movement he leads, having on the advocacy that Black communities are having with our engagement of fiscal and tax policies? Is there still a disconnect?
Well, first of all, I will never speak against a brother beloved. I think Dr. Barber not only is a very brilliant fellow, but he can preach too. And I think that Dr. Barber and Dr. John Mendez, frankly, from Winston-Salem, Emmanuel Church in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, they together created the Moral Mondays. I think that should be on record that Dr. Mendez was a part of that. Dr. Mendez permitted or thought that Barber had more of a passion to try to take it outside of North Carolina, for which he did. And now we know that it is a massive movement, and the critique for his movement now will be under the gaze of history. I also think it is fair to say that Dr. Barber filled a space, a vacuum that people weren't stepping into. And his courage cannot be discounted. He's a courageous man. There are people who are working with Dr. Barber that you and I know who are absolutely brothers and sisters who are definitely about us. Mm-hmm. I think the larger critique is, why is it that white folks were either permitted or attached themselves so quickly? And without them, on the one hand, where would we be? That is the movement. But on the other hand, when are some of us going to help, right? Some of us have to ask, is Dr. Barber's leadership, can we accept that? No, he's not an AMER. 19th century AMErs and AME Zionists were running the show, boy, for liberal, for rights. That's just, that's not me, that's facts. Black church. And in the 20th century, progressive Baptists certainly caught up. But what it seems to be missing in the 21st century is that none of the aforementioned is, I write in that book, as I recall, we're on the front lines in that respect.
Right, yep.
So what is God going to say? Okay, well, since the AMEers and the AME Zionists and Progressive National Baptists aren't coming, then I'll just take the, no, that's not how God works. God says, okay, well, you fellas, and y'all tired? I'm not tired. Let me just lift up a new prophet. And so I support him. Now, the fiscal and tax policies, for example, I think that I would like everyone who's watching this is to support Bread for the World. Bread for the World is one of the leading, if not the leading organization that addresses fiscal and tax policies, because if you can't eat, you can't live. So we need, for example, a part of the reparations is a full tax credit for people taking care of children. We need a guaranteed income or full employment so that people may eat, and that can be considered a SNAP program. So there are ways to get foodstuffs into people, and Dr. Barber's organization is addressing those issues, and therefore I am full throat and I believe in what he's doing. Now, to these other things you talk about. So my whole plan was, back whenever I got the plan, was to write a hermeneutic, then write a narrative, then write a rhetoric, and then write a theology, and then a homiletic. I wanted to leave a full homiletic system. I don't call it method. Method can be very linear, and there's no room for dynamic of the individual. So I like something that I would call organic, some kind of organic system. So I wrote the hermeneutic. I don't remember when, but I can tell you this. Nah, I'm not going to say that's too cynical, and that gets to my personality. But I wrote the hermeneutic because I believe if your hermeneutic's wrong, everything's wrong. Right now,
watching that book called "Lifting the Veil Over Eurocentrism." A double consciousness.
Right. So I wrote the hermeneutic to address the psychological self, the double consciousness self. One cannot interpret if one is not healthy. If one is looking for answers from a European support, then you're going to come up with wrong answers. You're just not going to get there from here, because their point of departure assumes that they are right. And I assumed that they were not right, because what I heard in my churches growing up and what I learned in formal education, they didn't go together. And so I was like, I don't know about that. And so over time, I decided that where most people assume they start with theology, almost everybody's school starts with theology when you start breaking this stuff down. But what if your theology's wrong? You assume your theology's right because you think your hermeneutic is right. You think your narrative is right, and you think how you persuade is right. I think you're wrong. Based on my experiences, you're wrong. And so I had to create a way to talk about the art and science of interpretation. That was first. Then we came out with the book we're talking about now, which is to write a narrative. The narrative, as you understand, and people reading the narrative, is to get to the pathology under the narrative. That is, are we healthy? If we deny first of all, if our hermeneutic is wrong, then we're not going to recognize the Bible's narratives, right? The Bible's narratives are liberation, organized liberation marches. Yahweh is the hero, right? Jesus is the hero of the New Testament, right? So, and what were they doing? They were resisting empire. And we can talk about all the empires that the Hebrew people came over, right? And they even let Yahweh be hero. They tell it, Yahweh's the hero, right? So that ought to tell all of us that hermeneutic should be understood from the people of the oppressed. Read the scripture from the people, from a lens of the oppressed. Mm-hmm. Secondly, the narrative is also through the lens of the oppressed. That is the narrative, the pathology. But Then one has to persuade, the art and science of rhetoric. And that is your composition, your arrangement, your organization, your precision, your purity, and your probity of language, blah, 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 on and on and on. Read the book. And so what I did, I wrote a book on all that stuff, and I put it into, I found that, for example, they tell us there are 5 canons of rhetoric, and the person who possesses all 5 canons of rhetoric is a peculiar man or a peculiar woman, which means that they are in rarefied air. And they are invention or discovery, as you and I may call it, something like convention. You've got to come up with a big idea. Mm-hmm. The second thing is you have to have style. The second one is arrangement of the first one is invention. The second one is arrangement. Then you're going to have style or eloquence. Then the fourth one is memory, and the fifth one is delivery. And if you have all of those things functioning, then you have the tool sets to be persuasive both on the public platform and behind the sacred desk. Right. So I wrote that. And so that book came out. It was supposed to come out. What year is this? This is 21. So that book came out in 2020. It was supposed to come out. When was the book? Whenever it was supposed to come out, but it didn't come out because of the virus. And so you're muted.
This is the Art of Eloquence you're talking about. That one?
Yeah. So that book came out a few months late because of virus. It came out in August, actually, of 2020. Now I'm getting it. Mm-hmm. But man, you know what? That book sold all kind of. They really sold. That book like went viral, as did the book we're discussing tonight. It really, amazing. So anyway, now I'm working on. So I was supposed to be working on a theology, and as you know, I studied systematic theology way back when. I don't trust my theology if I have to go back and write a European theology. I'm not writing that. Mm-hmm. See, I prefer Baldwin to Bart, and I prefer let us say Billie Holiday, even to Niebuhr. I prefer those voices because, in truth, they are theologians. Mm-hmm. Right?
And this is that theological source piece. Cone talks about it. Kane Hope Felder talks about it. Dean Pierce of Howard now just wrote a piece about it because the Western perspective tries to control the sources. So when you want to, even your first book, that was a struggle because you didn't credit enough white sources.
There are none in that book.
And that was
a black label, dog.
Right. That was a challenge. It took 7 years for you to publish that first one because.
Oh, yes. Because all of the publishers. Can I tell a really quick story about that book? This is crazy, man. So I send the book off to Africa World Press. And by the way, Africa World Press is one of the best press in the world. Yeah. Right. So I said, I know they're not going to publish it. Right. I send it off anyway. Right. Man, I get a call from them and they said, we want to publish this book. And I said, this is amazing. And so we published the book. By the way, I really like that book because I had no filters, right? No filters, right? I'm just doing what I do, right? And so the book is published. And so the Progressive Convention asked me to do 3 days of lectures on that book. And so we're in the big old hall at this convention, right? And it's like 1,000 chairs in there. And if there were 50 people in there, I mean, it was a crowd, right? So I'm standing up there, and I'm saying, why do they have me in this big space with all these few people in here? But I knew they were taping it, so I went ahead and just really worked really hard. Dr. Drummer from Washington was in there.
California Drummer.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. California Drummer was there. And he heard me. And so he bought, like, I don't know how many copies of the book he bought, but he bought one in particular. And he overnighted it to Dr. J. Alfred Smith in Cali. And Dr. Smith read the book while we were still in convention. So by the time the convention was over, Dr. Smith, being Dr. Smith,
yeah, that's amazing.
He read the book.
Yeah.
Watch this. So after convention's over, I get a call from Dr. J. Alfred Smith. I do. Me. I didn't know it was him until I heard him, because it was like a number I didn't know who it was. I called it. And I went, oh my gosh, he called me. And so Dr. Drummer must have given him my number. So he tells me that I wrote a book that many people in his peer group knew needed to be written.
I think I remember this, right?
And he was grateful that, I had written the book. And, I was dumbfounded because, I'm from this old school. When somebody like J. Alfred Smith calls you,
Yes,
that's huge.
Right.
He's one of the most, he's that guy. He's among that group. I mean, we can call them. We know who they are.
Right.
And he's one of them. But here's what he told me. He said, Dr. Evans, he said, I called Jeremiah Wright to tell him about your book. He said, J. Alfred is in South Africa and he is lecturing at the University of Pretoria as we speak. And you know what, Dr. Evans? I said, no, sir. He said, he already has a copy of the book. And he is lecturing in South Africa from your book. Mm-hmm. So the first book went viral before here.
Yeah, and you had to get a whole different other. The publisher had to do a reprint. And
they had to reprint the book. Right. It's like in his third reprint or whatever.
Right.
But it was Africans who got it. Yeah. Bang! They understood what we were talking about, right? Now let me tell you the last piece. So Dr. Wright was talking to me the other day, and I don't even know what we were talking about. But anyway, the first book came up. Here's what he didn't tell me. Alan Bozak was with Bozak. So these dudes are lecturing. So Dr. Bozak is also lecturing from that book. So the Lord had me stand in front of 50 people.
While your book is all over the world.
Yeah, that's a trip.
Wow.
So anyway, but what we're doing now is I'm doing something that's I'm struggling in some respects. I'm doing a piece on Dr. King, which I've never done. Mm-hmm. I wrote only like 2 things on Dr. King that's been published, but those have been essay things, like for journals or whatever. And I don't want to get too far into it, but I'm trying to follow the same train of thought that we're talking about now. But I will tell you that there's an intersection with how King uses living metaphor that can be identified and located in everything he does. And I believe how he lives living metaphor as symbol is how he pulled down empire. And there's so far been very strong evidence that we're on the right track. I'm finishing the 3rd chapter as we speak, or I'm trying to finish the 3rd chapter as we speak, where there's an intersection between King's narrative, liberation narrative, and his liberation rhetoric, or his living narrative and his living rhetoric. Dr. King is writing a narrative for the people. From 1955 to 1968, America had never seen a move of God in this country the way he did at that time. And nobody knew what was really going on. So there was no theology that King had studied at Crocia, no theology he had studied at BU, and no theology he had read. American Eurocentric theology could not address a movement on American soil where God's Spirit was moving through the oppressed. And now the oppressed is the authority on God, not Europeans. And so Dr. King has to create a narrative, a rhetoric, and a theology. People say he had no systematic theology. I don't think that's true. Now, I'm not a theologian, but I know enough about it to say I don't agree with that. I think Dr. King was writing a theology from 55 to 68. Now, had he lived beyond that, he could have reflected on it and he could have maybe systematized it. But to say that Dr. King did not have his own theology and his theology was not independent of European thought, I believe that's not true. And so for Dr. King to explain to the world what was going on, he wrote his own narrative, independent of the white gaze. He wrote a narrative that said that he was independent of double consciousness. And even though Dr. King was arguing on behalf of Negroes and was born in a Negro culture, because of his Pentecost moment, he was no longer a Negro. He was a black man in America. He had an independent mind. He understood how to commune with God. He understood that he broke from neo-orthodoxy that he was taught. He said that Bart was cool, but Bart was wrong. God is not beyond knowing. Instead, we do not have a language adequate enough to describe God. But to say that folk don't know God is to deny folk we know who know God. That's not true. And if people want to ground it, then look at the kitchen table experience. He knows there is a God. That was a Pentecost moment. And his ministry was a Pentecost experience, not Pentecostal, but Pentecost, right? And so King understands that like a cloven tongues of fire, well, it wasn't cloven tongues of fire that came down on them, but we didn't have words to describe the inaugural presence of the third person in the Trinity. So Luke has to use similes and metaphors to describe this piercing into human affairs, the incarnation of the Holy Ghost, right? And so Luke has to rely on metaphor because there are no words to describe it. So we should stop saying we don't know God. Just say we don't have a language to describe the divine. It's arrogant to say God is beyond knowing. He talks to you every freaking day, so you ought to know that. But let's just say we don't have a language to describe it. Human language is inadequate. Birds do pretty well. Like early in the morning when I hear the cardinals, they kind of got it better than we do.
That's almost like a Thurman kind of piece, the mysticism. He saw it in so much more.
Yes, and that's why we have to take Thurman seriously, beyond other reasons. And so I'm arguing that if you can understand how King uses metaphor, you can understand King's theology. That's what I believe. And so there's a holistic approach to this, right?
So, this is something
but I want to reemphasize just for your audience.
Yes, sir.
King and now Evans, right? Don't tell me God is beyond knowing. That's not true. But we don't have a language that is sophisticated enough to talk about God. Now, that's a part of praise, isn't it? Praise is admitting we don't have a language adequate enough to talk about God. So we do what we can.
That's
right.
Got a hold of me. I can't explain. It's Black folk have been trying to use it. We don't have the adequate language, but we've been expressing, and Eurocentric have told us, well, our stuff, our sources, our hymns, our Negro spirituals aren't theology. So here's what I hope people are getting from this dialogue. So we've talked about the book. Now you're hearing the free kind of speaking. Dr. Evans talks about this idea of a new narrative throughout his books, he's talked about, in essence, we need to own our own narrative. We cannot be boxed in from a Eurocentric perspective, expecting that to be our saving narrative. Mm-hmm. It's a conversation about risking to break out of the box. So hopefully you heard this dialogue and you've been challenged in some ways about this sense of a new consciousness, that you begin to ask different questions about your own social location, that you begin to say, why are things the way that they are? And you are no longer comfortable with what you see, that you are willing to challenge the social norms, the conversational norms, the believed myth of who we are, and to think differently, to have a Black freedom. You need, I hope in this, you found that you need a different freedom, not just free from chains, but free mentally as well, to identify as your own person. I hope you've gained some of that. Dr. Evans, so I want to say thank you. Thank you so much for this time. For those who want to know more about Dr. Evans, definitely research Morehouse School of Religion. Make sure you follow him there. He writes an awful lot. He lectures an awful lot. And he is a major preacher indeed. If you are a pastor and you're looking to make sure that your people you're trying to help them get there, Dr. Evans is definitely one who can help you communicate more. He can be a phenomenal guest preacher. If you are in seminary and you're looking for something that's going to challenge you a little bit, mess around and grab one of Dr. Evans' books. Either of them, you will definitely glean an awful lot from it. Dr. Evans, sir, God bless you. Thank you so very, very much. Definitely let Miss Evans know I said hello. God bless her. Once we get through this COVID, hopefully we can connect, we can hang out, and you all can have some time with Christian, as you all have done with Micah and Nathan.
Can't wait. And congratulations to you and all you're doing. And Dr. Ball, I state again, I am deeply appreciative for this time, but more importantly, I'm very proud of the ministry that you share, and I'm proud of the cadre that's coming. There are some preachers in your circle that are going to stand flat-footed and proclaim the unsearchable riches of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And ultimately, as that is the most important thing to me. As I stand down, you must stand up.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
God bless you, brother.
Bless you. Y'all, if this is helpful, go ahead, click share, invite others to benefit from it as well. Also, get on Amazon, buy the books, this book, buy all the books, because again, he's working through some stuff, and you should definitely follow along indeed. All right, y'all. God bless.
Night.